Hi, and welcome to the third in our third season of Lunch Orders, where we've been exploring artificial intelligence and the role it plays in our lives. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. For my guest Ruby and I today, that's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Take a minute to think about where the lands that you're on and pay your own respects to elders past and present, recognising that this always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to say thanks to our education partner, the Victorian Association of Teaching of English, who has been producing the most excellent classroom resources for this series. Of course, you don't have to explore it in the classroom. You can listen to it in the library, in the lunchroom, in the car, wherever you like. But if you would like to dive deeper, then those resources are available. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Ruby Quail, who is a creative technologist at Acme, specialising in human-computer interaction and digital user experience. Ruby's work focuses on developing inventive methods for sharing stories, culture and experiences online, in venues and across institutions. Her expertise lies in creating immersive digital platforms that enhance user engagement and transform the way people interact with technology. How cool. Today we're going to be looking at the role that AI will play in our future and thinking about some of the possible futures that we might end up in. So as always, Ruby will start with her soapbox and then we'll have a chat and finish with a question for you to think about. Ruby, over to you.
Thank you, Beck. So my name is Ruby, as Beck has lovely introduced me. We now are in the era of AI, at least according to Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, who said this in 2021 after playing with ChatGPT, the tool that has taken over the world in the past couple of years. AI is in everything now. We have AI in all the online products we use. AI is being used in governments, in cultural organizations, all around the world. But before we talk about where we might see AI in the future, it's important to think about what it is and where it has come from. So at its core, I won't go into the details, but at its core, AI are big collections of numbers. So big, huge collections in the billions. If you've done sort of matrices in mathematics, that's a very good way of thinking of it. They're these huge squares with billions upon billions of numbers. The way these work is that the people who make these tools, they turn digital content, so maybe stories we've written or videos, images, audio, anything that can sort of converted into a series of numbers like the internet does every day, and feeds them into these systems to get some output. This output might be a category, it might be the next letter in a sequence, it might be another image or another video. There are various different ways of doing it, but it's important to think of it that it's usually a series of outputs, and then we pick from that which one is the best. So the way this works is that once we know what output we want from a particular input, so a particular bit of content, we then adjust those numbers ever so slightly to sort of meet, so it does that, so it matches our expectations. And we do this thousands upon thousands, millions of times even, with millions of different content, each adjusting all of these billions of numbers, very small amounts, until it creates things that we are quite predictable and quite understandable and relatable. And that's how we've led to these systems that are able to identify a kangaroo in an image, or could write an essay, for example, because it has received so much of this information that it's encoded in these numbers, the bits that are important, and then can produce something that probably is fairly similar to what you wanted. There's sort of another way of thinking about it, which I think is quite good, is like functions that simplify and extract all the information from these big systems. So a very good artist, Eric Savaggio, describes the images that AI creates as data visualizations, because in a sense they are if you took at all the information and all the images that they've received, this is kind of what it thinks the sort of amalgam or what it thinks the sort of information you want out of it is. But a good way of thinking about this is to categorize these sort of systems into two different categories. So we have classifiers. These were sort of the first tools that came out of AI. So these are things like image recognition, so facial recognition, these sort of things, natural language processing, so figuring out what you're trying to say in language. You could even include things like transcription tools in this. And then the other sort of tool, the one that sort of is now in vogue, is what's called generators or generative AI. So these are your ChatGPTs, these are your DALL-E or Midjourney, your image generators. Another sort of category that sort of is quite important to these and is used quite a lot, but is sort of a bit less seen, are the sort of image editors. So things like Adobe's Firefly, which sort of can upscale or change images based on prompts, as well as things like NVIDIA's Upscaler, which is a tool that takes small images that might be produced by a video game and makes them bigger, so that you can get higher fidelity graphics out of something where you might not have been able to have the ability for before. So the technology to create these tools has existed since the 60s, when the sort of mathematics behind all of this was being developed. But it didn't really come into fruition until sort of the what's called the Web 2.0 boom. So when we started having social media, blogs, emails, and we started producing all of this data, this large amount of content that these systems need to sort of optimize. So in 2012, one of the things that was developed is we started having these huge image selections. So we had Flickr, we had Instagram, and all these sort of tools that were collecting thousands upon thousands of images. And so a database called ImageNet was created, which was a huge amount of images that had descriptions. So a description described what was in the image, and they had thousands upon thousands of that. And that tool was given to a bunch of researchers to make works from that. And one of the researchers, among others, Ilya Sutskever, who then went on to be one of the founding members of OpenAI and be quite important in that scene, developed something called AlexNet, which was a tool that was the first one that took all of this information in and managed to classify it. So it could identify, there's an apple in this image, there's a banana in this image, like there's two people in here. And this sort of is what kind of started the craze, like, oh, there's use here. This functionality is quite useful. So you started seeing more and more similar things pop up as sort of the technology improved. Facial recognition became a huge thing as that started being quite possible and profitable. But at the same time, you started having some of the pushback. Timnit Gebru, who was a technologist at Google, wrote a paper about how these systems are very, very bad at dealing with people of color, for example. And she was kicked out of Google for that. It was quite a big sort of scandal. And so all of this stuff was all happening and growing and building. And then it sort of led to, all of this stuff. And eventually you started getting the generative models. So GPTs were being developed by Google and OpenAI. And then in 2021, ChatGPT arrived, and here we are now. I should preface this sort of discussion of what's happening now as AI currently is. I'm personally not a huge fan. It's a massive, important part of the world we live in, whether we like it or not. But I am probably more biased towards the negative than the positive for a lot of these things. And I think a lot of people will have quite personal relationships with this stuff as it sort of tries and sort of works into the more human and sort of personal parts of the world. But there are a lot of good benefits to it. So, for example, the transcription tools like OpenAI's Whisper have massive opportunities for the deaf and hard of hearing community. They are very, very good at taking English audio as well as other languages, particularly in an American accent, but and converting that into text, which then we can use in other tools. So that has been very useful. These tools, as they sort of are designed, are very good at analyzing large amounts of data. So there are fields such as medical research where there was huge amounts of data, and trying to find sort of the importance in that. While these tools can't necessarily, handle the mathematics of that, which I'll get into a bit later, they're very good at giving researchers and scientists somewhere to move. So like a prompt that this might be interesting, this might be interesting. And there's a lot of value in that. And it's leading to sort of medical breakthroughs. a lot of written work can be done quite well with ChatGPT. We've sort of found that out. There's sort of opportunities for efficiencies there, and that might change those kind of things, as well as image editors have the same. And upscaling tools are being used in video gaming and CGI all the time now. Like, these are very useful tools for this space. But there are also drawbacks. One of the key aspects of these systems is they don't really have a knowledge of formal logic, so they can't tell what's true or false. They're sort of unable to sort of have that distinction. Everything kind of exists in a probability space where this is more likely or this is more likely, which means that they're not very good at, they get things wrong sometimes or make things up because they can't really tell fact from fiction, if that makes sense, because it's all just content to them. So these things are quite buggy when it comes to sort of facts and truth. AI researchers call them hallucinations. I think that's a bit more sort of generous than it needs to be. These are sort of software bugs, really. These are things that they're doing that aren't what they want. The other thing, which I'm sure other sort of things we've talked about, is the content that these things were trained on was gathered in ways that aren't particularly, generous to the people who created it. It's easy to see this as the result of huge amounts of theft of online work, of art, of all of this stuff. And the energy and the actual cost of running these things is quite severe. So it's a lot of money and power to use all this. Google, in their last year, used 50% more electricity than any year before. And a lot of these tech companies, because of the climate emergency that we're in, are trying to reduce their emissions to try and help the world, and that is now reversed because of their desire to use these tools. So there's a huge risk there just in the abilities of that. But also, it's had massive cultural ramifications on us. Essays, which have long been the tool of gathering information about what people know, are now quite a lot less useful because they're so easy to just generate based on what exists. It's very hard to use that as a tool for understanding. Because of the AI technology that's getting built into smartphones, into cameras now, these photos no longer have the sort of burden of proof that is expected for things like court cases. So we're having court cases in the States that, because images were taken on smartphones, that evidence is being thrown out because they don't feel like it can be trusted. There was a huge problem among deepfakes and sort of the generation of lookalikes and all of this sort of like appearance thing. That's been a massive problem for public figures, as well as, non-consensual pornography and women in general who are having to deal with the sort of ramifications of this. And then there's just the cultural sort of weight of how these tools are used. Like any other technology, it has that baggage. If they're used in warfare, if they're used in policing, they have the baggage of how these are used. And so they have to the ramifications of that. So now looking to the future, there's sort of three ways I see that this can go. The sort of more likely one I see is because of all of these costs, there's probably going to be a crash. So a lot of these tools are very expensive to run. So eventually that won't work. So there's a lot of money that is currently allowing these things to work at the moment. Those big investors, they might go, no, I've had enough. I'm not getting my money out of this. I'm going to go invest in something safer, property or something. I don't know. But that would mean that a lot of the big tools like ChatGPT would become either very expensive for people to use, or would lose a lot of their sort of, value when it comes to sort of generating up-to-date information. So any of the search stuff was probably going to go away in that way. I think it still will be around. They're still very good at generating text, and a lot of sort of text that needs to be generated that is still going to be looked over by more experienced people, that will probably still be generated by ChatGPT. So jobs where that is a big part of it, they still might go away. Things that are probably quite safe in this case is anything which has to do with numbers. These systems are really bad at mathematics, which is very weird for a thing that is built on top of mathematics, but it's all probabilities, and 1 + 1 doesn't probably equal 2. So like these systems are not very good at this stuff. But I think a lot of the sort of larger sort of systems will keep using more technical systems that don't rely on these probabilities. The sort of likely, let's say, conservative sort of hope for this, the future, sort of what I'm kind of referring to as linear growth, is more about the sort of tools that are going to come next in this thing. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of development in what are called large action models, which is sort of a play on simile, which is called large language models, which is what ChatGPT is. So these action models have similar inputs to ChatGPT of text and stuff, but they do things. So they might change settings on your phone, they might call someone. Rather than producing information, they produce actions. There's been a few attempts of this in the past few years. Some objects like the Humane Pin and Rabbit R1 were some, but they didn't work particularly well and weren't well received. But large companies like Google and Apple are trying to do this in the next sort of 24 months, 2 years, and that's going to be, if this works out, that might sort of keep the momentum for these sort of tools going. But I do also think that the creative industries are probably going to be quite safe even then. If you think about our most popular sort of creatives, Taylor Swift, for example, a lot of her popularity comes from her relatability, and it's quite hard to relate to the tool, these sort of things. So while they might affect jobs within the creative industries, I think a lot of the sort of artistry has a very human element that this stuff can't replicate at this level. However, there are people in Silicon Valley, in the tech sphere, who are known as effective accelerationists, who believe that technical progress is for the good of all humankind and needs to be accelerated and done as quickly as possible. And getting in the way of that is causing harm. So these people, who are called effective accelerationists, or EACs, as they like to be called, believe that the future of AI is generating what's called AGI, so artificial general intelligence. The idea of this is a system, a tool that is indistinguishable from humans when it comes to sort of how they think and how they work. Their sort of goal is that we will have these systems in place and they will compete with each other and get better and sort of train and become more powerful and more capable, almost like a sort of technical natural selection. And we will have these super beings that will control everything in the world. Any kind of technical system will be managed by these sort of, loving gods, the sort of dream here. And so some of these people think that this kickstart of this kind of era of human enlightenment will happen in the next 10, 15 years. Some people think it might happen in the next 100. A lot of people think it probably will never happen at all, but these are the kind of conversations that are happening in Silicon Valley. So those are the sort of like three ways I see AI coming from here. It'll either crash and burn, in which case what we kind of see now as the sort of thing is the upper limit of what AI can do. So it probably will still be used for small tasks. There'll still be a lot of interest in it, and they'll still require the kind of legislation and sort of thinking around how we use it as we do now. It could continue to grow, in which case more and more industries will start seeing it being adopted, but it probably won't replace a lot of the more creative, more human sort of side of things, and there'll probably still need to be a lot of sort of leadership kind of capacities as well as technical roles to sort of manage that. Or it'll become the new god, to say, and we will all be watched over by these wonderful beings of pure mathematics.
I mean, I've seen movies that start with that concept and none of them seem to end well. Wow. I actually can't believe how much you have taught me in 10 short minutes. That's extraordinary. And I have a page of frankly deranged scrawl. The first question that I would like to ask, though, and I'm not suggesting that we would want to do this, but given how embedded AI is in all of our systems of being, really, is it too late to turn back the clock on it, even if we wanted to? Like, could we say, okay, no more AI and make it go away? Or is it too much a part of our lives now?
I think it will never go away now completely. There was a time when AI was still quite embedded in our societies and our technical systems, but was not quite at the same sort of, level of infamy as it is now with the things like ChatGPT. So I think that level of AI is here to stay. We've had I mean, think about self-driving cars. They rely on object detection, which is usually used using AI models and these sort of classifiers, as I sort of went through. So this stuff I think is going to stay quite solid, but also this stuff's been around for now 10, 15 years, and it's getting to be quite robust. Like we're getting to have quite a good understanding of how these things work. The newer tools, very much not so. Like these are still quite large and unwieldy and very hard to sort of know exactly how they'll respond in certain situations. But I think a lot of the smaller systems, they're going to remain. It's more these new tools that require so much energy and so much power to run that those might become either very expensive or just very, very niche in how they're used.
It's pretty alarming to think how much AI has been embedded so casually into our lives by way of free usage, to think that at some point we'll be expected to pay for something that presumably by that stage we will be incredibly reliant on. This is a theme that's come up across all of the sessions so far, is this idea that we as creators, legislators, controllers, however you like to phrase it, are kind of way behind the 8 ball when it comes to the acceleration of AI, as in it's accelerating away from us faster than we can conceive of it. Do we understand the capabilities of AI, do you think, or can it still do things that we haven't even imagined yet?
I don't think there's consensus on that. So a lot of people, there's an understanding for a lot of people. And I would say that we're fairly aware of, because we're fairly aware of the mechanics of it, we're fairly aware of the kind of things it can do. But we've been surprised before. So, I mean, ChatGPT was something a lot of people in this field didn't necessarily see coming. Some people did, there was a lot there. But before that, GPT was only very used as basically autocorrect, as to predict stuff. It's like predictive text. So it was used a bit in journalism and all these copywriting stuff, but we didn't see it as the sort of general purpose tool that it's sort of become in a lot of respects. So I think there is still certainly a possibility that something will come out of nowhere and we'll be like, oh, okay, this is big. This is going to change how we think about information. This is going to change all these worlds. But I think there's still some tension there around people who are like, we know what it's doing. What it's doing is not worth the value that it costs. This will go away. And people are like, we're on the precipice of something. Like there's something big around the corner. And while I'm more in the former camp, I can't sort of discount that there are a lot of people who are like, no, this could be good. This could be a major thing if we've been wrong about this stuff in the past.
Yeah, okay. I'm from the age of dial-up internet. You know, the internet became a thing during my lifetime. Like we didn't have a computer when I was a kid, and getting one was a big deal. So just to provide some context of my very basic understanding of technology, or basic relationship with technology, I should say. Given that, I feel like there's a real blur between where technology ends and AI begins. Is there a clear boundary? Like, are there things that you would define, like for robots, for example, or even autocorrect? Like, at what point do we go, oh yes, this is AI?
I think the boundary is clear in some ways and not in others. So one good way of thinking is a lot of sort of technical stuff. One of the sort of hallmarks, I guess, with these systems that use such big numbers is they're outside the realm of understanding of the people who make them. Like they don't know what, they can sort of intuit through a lot of things what this number might mean. So one of these numbers might be encoded to mean whether something is made of glass or plastic. We don't know, but we don't, like, that's so complicated and so convoluted to our brains that we can't really tell. Where there's a lot of technical systems robots, for example, the engineering beside robots has been known about for years. It's just sort of all of these sort of optimizations and, clever tricks and stuff that allows, that system to continue to work, that sort of puts it in sort of a different sort of level. But the sort of things that are going to affect AI as sort of a tool is really the sort of reliability of it. So the probability sort of systems that can't accurately always give the same answer. There's a sort of term in the industry called stochastism, which is this idea that it won't always be the same thing. You can put the same amount of information into something like ChatGPT and it'll give you a different answer every time, which also makes it very hard to test to see if it's doing anything wrong because you don't know. It can always sort of curveball. So there's a fear and I guess tension there around these systems that other technical sort of systems and other technical improvements that we've had to our lives might not have.
I feel like the intersection between AI and issues of ethics and privacy is particularly fascinating to me, and certainly one that seems to get a lot of airtime when it comes to media and publicity, and also just generally public outrage, both in things like deep fakes and personal privacy online, your body, your image being used without consent, but also in terms of intellectual property. In fact, I was at an academic conference last week and some of the researchers there who are working in areas of AI were talking about researchers whose work is now being used to train AI, and they didn't even think about building that into their original contract because the thought of AI wasn't a thing when they signed the contract. So there's this idea that I think our ability to protect our privacy is already out of our control. Is that true? Are there ways that people can and should be protecting their privacy, or is it kind of already out of our hands?
I think it's complicated. I don't think it's out of our hands. I think we always have the case these things. These things can't enter our brain. Brains are still they still exist in their silos to a certain degree. But I think a lot of the sort of tensions here that have required this kind of stuff have been around for a while. Like these big data and sort of surveillance capitalism issues around all of these social networks following us across the internet and all of these trackers and things are now just sort of being taken advantage of in different ways. They've been used by advertisers for a very long time. The sort of, I guess, issues around, image ownership and work ownership have been a problem for a while, but because they were never used at this sort of scale, they were sort of minimized to a certain degree. So I think a lot of that has become more clear. One of the ramifications of this sort of AI boom is that a lot of services which have been a bit more laissez-faire about how they work with others and share information have become a lot more protective. So, for example, Reddit, a very large social media network, which allowed everyone to look into it and gain information and track it. Hugely useful for researchers, particularly in cultural studies and all of this stuff, have recently just locked down completely and said, no technical systems can use it because we don't trust you're not going to use it to train AI and we don't want to use. So these systems are locking down. They're lawyering up, if you look at the New York Times and Getty Images, who are trying to sue these companies who are making it. The sort of creators of the sort of world, I guess, are now getting a lot more protective about how their information is used online. So while this not necessarily affects us, I mean, if we're still posting things on Meta's platforms like Facebook or Instagram, they're going to use that to train their AIs. Same with X or Twitter and Elon Musk's Grok AI, as he calls it. All of these things, Google with their Gemini, these all have these different tools and they're going to use all the data they can get hold of. But there are a lot of systems and a lot of, we're starting to see the emergence of social media outside of these platforms. They've got the metaverse and sort of Mastodon and all this stuff, which exists kind of separate to that. Everyone's sort of kind of centralizing in a lot of ways. And I think that might end up making it hard for these AI companies to maintain the same level of content inflow that they've benefited from in the last decade.
It seems to me like there's this kind of approximation that comes out of a lot of AI, which you've described, or at least in my mind, these two things are connected as probability,
Yeah.
That everything can be almost like about right. It comes up with an approximation of an image or an approximation of dancing or an answer or whatever. And I'm thinking about the situations where I use AI the most and where I see my students use AI the most, which certainly you mentioned it earlier is currently in translation. I have so many students in the classroom who will use AI to translate during the class. Do you think that we as a society risk a kind of dumbing down of the way that we learn and engage by learning via these approximations, this kind of near enough is good enough idea?
I don't think so. I think we've always had these kind of approximations in many systems. I mean, the whole field of economics is based on a lot of these kind of approximations and sort of guesses and sort of probabilities. So I think we'll need to really think about how we use these tools and be very clear about when something is like that. I mean, language is a good example because a lot of language is quite fluid and changes over time as well. So maybe this is the perfect tool for these, because if these things are getting trained on like the corpus of a particular language, so like all the written books, they'll have a pretty good understanding of written English. Like that's just how this system works. And they might not have a perfect dictionary understanding of written English, but they'll be able to do it pretty well. And in a lot of cases, that's good enough for communication. There were bigger fish to fry here, kind of thing. So I think that will affect the ways that we think about the sort of accessibility of these sort of things. But I think as long as we're sort of very careful about communicating when we're using these systems and being very clear about what are the things where truth and accuracy and sort of rigidity are important, and what are the things where we can be a bit more looser on this, and it'll help. So I think we will need to reframe how we do a lot of this sort of education and sort of understanding and communication. But I think we have all the tools we need to sort of develop frameworks and understanding in this new paradigm that we're in.
Look, we are hitting time, but I have one last question. I think it speaks directly to our audience. It seems to me that most of the people that I've spoken to about AI, the more you know about it, the more wary you are about its future, and that we're heading to this like knowledge is power situation. So for young people who might engage quite casually with AI, but who are certainly going to end up in this future where it is in some way a part of their lives, what should they be learning now? Like, where should they focus their knowledge so that they can have that power when it comes to thinking about a future with AI in it?
Interesting. So I think a lot of these tools rely on this understanding of managing these large amounts of information. So the research around neural networks, which were the systems that do it. So these are sort of more the STEMmy kind of technical ways of how this work will sort of create the underpinnings of thinking about what it can and can't do. And I think having that knowledge will help you think about things from like first principles and then go, oh, I guess it can do this. And that will allow you to be a bit more critical around how these tools are used. It's also worth sort of understanding, the technical sort of frameworks that make up the world. So like why are data centers where all this stuff is run is really important. So having some knowledge around, the tech industry and sort of these technical space and the technical growth will sort of be able to help you understand the costs and sort of benefits here. I think there is still actually a very good use in, as you sort of talk about, in English, since all these tools are trained on the corpus of English writing. Being able to have a good understanding of English actually makes it very much easier to use these tools. There's this thing called prompt engineering, which is writing particular prompts to get particular outputs from ChatGPT and stuff. And a lot of that sort of is mirroring the kinds of advice we'd give to people in creative writing or in writing sort of formal works, because we're trying to emulate all of that body of work that exists. So there's almost, it's almost like know your enemy in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of skills that are still going to be very important in understanding how these systems work and really deciding when and where to use them and when and where not to.
Amazing. Well, I think that brings us quite nicely to your provocation or your final question for us. So over to you.
So one thing I think that is great to think about when it comes to AI is if we look at all the ways that it's changed our society up until now, and we look at the ways that it could change our society into the future, at what point does it start feeling like it's changed, it's gone too far? Like, where is the point where we think, okay, we need to, dial this back? What is the level where we need to say that's not okay? And what is the level where we can sort of go, yeah, I think we can work with that?
Amazing. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ruby. That was incredible. And I hope that everyone feels as if they've learnt as much as I have. And we'll see you next time for our very last lunch orders of term 3.